Okay, guess what time it is? Are there any other stragglers from the outside? We're good? Okay. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. So can I have everyone's attention because this is what we call the speed of live right here, where sometimes you may not get a chance to finish that sentence before it's time to actually. We are going to start right now in terms of both the actual pod. Choose your studio archetype. This will absolutely come into play later in terms of how much leeway you will get for the community and the market. Yeah. So one thing I'll mention here. So one thing I'll mention here is that it would be good for one person on each team to actually keep score. We are going to be game dev honest here, so no bullshit. There's no such thing as a wrong decision in this particular case because there is no business to actually run quite yet. So, all right, everyone got their archetypes? Okay. Now, here's the most important thing to actually know about these archetypes. And I'm just gonna go over here. No, there's no tricks. There's like this is I am not the Joker. There's no tricks whatsoever. If you picked Indie Darling, you'll get no leeway. If you picked mid-tier, depending on the level of funding you have, you'll get some leeway. If you pick this, you'll get a very little bit of leeway from the actual community. You may get some leeway if you're an indie darling if you already have a well-received title. We have someone's joined. You can join. We're split into a couple teams here, so it's all good. All right, so your first decision, and there are a couple of caveats that come with this decision. This assumes that you have made it through at least 18 months of hardcore player testing where your overall user score is at least a 4.6. Why is it a 4.6? Because that is actually the sort of overall measurement required for a person to stop whatever game they're actually playing and join yours. So 4.4, 4.3, 4.2, you're already dead. You are not going to market. That's from just general sort of publisher experience. So this assumes you've got all that correct right off the bat. Here's your first thing. You got 90 days to ship, which as we know is not a lot of time sort of overall. You can ship 2.5 features in this particular time that you'll be polished, will be ready for the actual audience. And I'll just let this linger for a second because you've done your announce, everything is good, everything is sort of going your way for a moment, and the entire community is very interested in what you're going to do next because they've already seen your title and been looking at it. And then this happens. A rival game in your genre just delivers an unbelievable seasonal plan that you must now sit down and react to. So just keep this in mind for a second. Pick one. So you are basically trying to say, how are we going to react to the fact that we only have 90 days to deliver 2.5 features? These are the sets we actually have to sit down and work with. So we're gonna power ship premium, we're gonna have a cosmetic quality of life plan, or we're just gonna delay everything and kind of hope everything works out from there. So talk amongst yourselves for a few minutes and basically figure out what you'd like to actually do. Yes. You guys have a couple minutes. You can easily talk amongst yourselves, everything else. All right, now prepare to score yourselves on the next slide. Just keep that in mind. All right, everyone have their sort of consensus of here's what we would actually do? So the real world implications of that play out immediately. And if the silence in the room is an indication, gasp, really? Yes, really. So the community and how they sort of react to these things, sometimes it depends on genre. Most of the time it depends on what is going to affect their immediate experience in game and what that gameplay is actually going to be like, and how much convenience you've assigned to paying players versus non-paying players, and how they actually feel about it. So why so secret is hey, we can't know more information, so on and so forth. So before I move on, does everyone have their current score? Because again, there's going to be a tally at the end for this, and I will explain sort of where you will end up in the market. Okay. Scenario number 2. Here is your community firestorm and where it starts to get a little bit more fun. Day 12 post-launch. So you are supposed to be in the honeymoon period where everyone is playing and enjoying your game. Only no, that's not what always happens. Yeah. Firestorm, problems. Might not be a problem, but perception is actually vastly more important in the first, we'll say, 24 hours of a problem like this versus anything else. And that perception can lead to many other things happening. Keep in mind, you are still within the first 2 weeks of launch. So, understanding that, what will you do? You guys can talk amongst yourselves, and about 5 minutes, we'll actually move to this next sort of scoring drought. No, there's no right. You guys gotta talk amongst yourselves. This is where you gotta dig. And just to drive something home for all you consider, there will be an immediate real world example of what this looks like before launch. All right, you guys got your respective answers and scores? Okay, All right, so keep those scores in mind because this is what actually happened during multiverses. So there's a lot of things that happened before launch. Obviously, some of those things were good and bad, but this is before we had done, we will say, any level of official announcement or anything else like that. Whenever there's a prognosis like this, the opinions about your game are already being formed by half the actual player base, and it is very, very, very important to set the correct expectations. So when you talk about what that means for the actual players, how many skins are going to be there, the incredible amount of running wild that we saw in terms of everyone is going to be in there. Yes, that is a real world sort of occurrence. In our game, that happened one way. For an FPS, that happens a different way. For a hero shooter, that happens a different way. For an action RPG, that happens different. The most important thing you can actually consider is how you're going to react to it, because you don't necessarily know what you're going to get into or what that community reception is going to be after your first response. So, that being said, score yourselves now. Yeah. So you're overall again. There's only, we'll say, where you're going to end up in the very end, and I'll explain how that maps again. So it's going to be fun. Okay. So as you continue to sort of go along this wonderful journey, here comes the third scenario: monetization pivot. You are 3 months into your KPI review, and things are suddenly not looking so good. You are given several scenarios by the CFO, we will say, or whoever is actually sort of liaison between you, publisher, so on and so forth. And you're going to get lots of conflicting data around, I want this, but I don't want it to feel like this. So given these scenarios, and given the, we will say, the content cadence that the players actually sit down and expect, here comes the next sort of set. Pick one. Yes, and the reason why this actually circles back to the same decisions is because typically the monetization structure for the game is already set. You will come back to this no matter what. So you guys have a couple minutes and say, all right, would you make that same decision again, understanding 3 months later you got the same thing? And I would also suggest right now is a good time to check where your momentum score is right about now. Yes.
So if you mentioned that the total per user DAU has dropped by about half, has anything changed in your overall incoming club users or in your core users?
It's proportional. We'll say your core users are more likely to stay at a plus 40 to 50% clip because they're all say the most golden cohort. But even they would be affected because there are simply less players to play with, which is going to affect their overall kind of gameplay, matchmaking, all that wonderful stuff. Marvel Heroes too. They work. They work perfectly fine as long as you know how to. I'll say work that DNA.
Oh, no, I'm trying to say something that's doing the technical production. I just ask questions. Yeah, so times to get to.
Okay, so I'll say everyone got their decisions. Everyone feel good about it. Fantastic. Well, wait. Is everyone ready? Everyone got the decisions? Okay. So the point I like to make for this is that there will be plenty of times where you may have to make a short-term monetization decision that may go against what the player base actually wants to stay in business, and vice versa. This is also one of the most important things when it comes to kind of overall publishing team and being able to explain the overall monetization logic you're using, because long term, it will affect you no matter what. And understanding how much money you are taking out of the Goodwill Bank versus how much money you're actually putting into it directly determines the user satisfaction of the game, which means here's how much we're actually sitting down and spending and happy. And there's nothing like happy money from happy players. They will not be happy all of the time. There has never been a single online game that has kept 100% of its players happy 100% of the time. They will be disgruntled at points no matter what because you got to do things for game balance and things like that. But you want them feeling pretty good about logging in pretty much all the time. All right, now we got some wild cards coming. So this is the scenario we like to call oh shit, and basically can happen to any game in any genre, because there are certain games that no matter what are black hole titles or miniature black hole titles for your specific genre that are going to take up your attention. And sometimes you don't actually have this long to sit down and react. So, same week as your patch, you have three options. Pick one. Yeah, it's unfortunate. Yeah, so take a couple of minutes and talk about what you would actually do in this scenario, because this is one that every single live game will find itself in after, anywhere from 6 months to 1 full year of operations. Something is going to affect you. It's a series of trade-offs pretty much across the board. And keep in mind, everything else you've got here, you want to maintain momentum. So now is an excellent time to check your momentum score and see where you guys are. These are always fun to me because, yes, if it seems impossible, that's on purpose. These are often the decisions you face in life. Okay, everyone got their scores, momentum scores, decisions? D. All right, everyone got their scores. Everyone got their how we're going to work. Score yourselves. So I mentioned here's your starting position earlier. This is where the expectations and setting them actually come in, because the players ultimately don't care. They care about how they're reacting to the content you're going to give them and if it's going to be the best thing to entertain them or not, period. All right, so now we have one more wild card, which is a good one. So whenever you win a surprise Game of the Year award or a surprise award of any kind, that is an opportunity. What that opportunity means is very, very different per team. Here are your four options. Which one would you pick? So when you say obviously, to the CFO, perhaps that is a very obvious thing. So take a couple minutes, discuss amongst yourselves, and we'll keep going. Okay, now score yourselves, because these are the outcomes it leads to. All right, so before I go to the next slide, take a moment amongst yourselves to tally up not just your momentum, all your wonderful scores, but also think about if there's anything else you would do differently now that you've actually seen it, because we're about to go into where the market performance would actually land you. Let's take a couple minutes and talk amongst yourselves for a little bit, and then we will get to, we will say the live or die part. Okay. All right. So take a second and tally your scores, see if there's anything else you would change, because this is where it gets to be a little bit ridiculous and fun. Okay. So without further ado, let's get to see how you would do in both this exercise and what that would actually track to for, say, STEAM. So here's where life gets fun. So how many of you ended up here? How many of you ended up here? And who ended up here? That is how fucking hard it is. So this is the STEAM top 30. So anything above a 9, we'll say anything above a 9, really even an 8, carried over at least 6 months to a year of strong decisions, gives you enough momentum to stay right here. That's when your VCs are happy, that's when your investors are happy, that's when, okay, you can go and expand the team, so on and so forth. Here's the most dangerous place to actually be, because this can be anywhere from 50 to 55% retention, and you're just limping along, injured like an unfortunate calf. And that is not the way you actually want to be in when we're talking about live. You're dead. Like, it doesn't matter what you do. You can sink $100 million into your next update. You are still dead. How many live games have we seen die over the past 4 years? They all end up right here. And the most important part of this exercise, those are only 4 to 5 decisions. The 5th one is a bonus decision because, well, if you have something that can potentially win Game of the Year, you actually are going to be up here anyway. So what does that actually come back to? That comes back to the core and the gameplay literally not being good enough, even though those early indicative tests said that it actually was. You as a team have to be able to push beyond what that score is actually saying and not settle, because settling in live is death, period. Every update must entertain the player. Every update must deliver an unbelievable amount of fun to that cohort if you're going to stay up here. And again, it is really, really, really hard to actually sit down and do. So just from this exercise, there were only 4 of those decisions, and sort of I heard amazing debate throughout the room of, hey, this is what we should do, this is for player good. Yes, you end up right there. And it's one of those cases where understanding how to manage community, understanding how to build those expectations, understanding how to monetize when you do have those moments of joy, functionally, even with the best intentions, because no one here, I think, was like, yep, so let's absolutely just do this because it'll be the worst thing for the player base and it'll just make us money. It didn't actually matter because you're still up here. And you really don't want to be in the Steam top 100. You want to be in the top 30. That's the thing that gets the most momentum. That's the thing that entertains the most players. And more importantly, that's the part that keeps your studio alive. So there are no more slides. I'm happy to go through that exercise again, but I would actually prefer if you guys at this point can now look at all the decisions you actually made and see, one, this is now open questions. You guys can just ask me whatever, but also just, are there different decisions you would have made? Or is there a different way that you would have done to get up here? Because that's many titles that we've worked on in the past and sort of the blood, sweat, and tears that have been earned from those lessons. And frankly, there are lots of cases where something could have gone wrong or something did go wrong, and we've had to correct that later. And you don't always get those chances in live, especially not when you're talking about 2-week cadence, 3-month cadence, 6-month cadence. Live games are built off momentum. If the player base senses your momentum is dying, they don't stick around either. So, that being said, questions?
How would you describe the relationship between momentum and goodwill?
So, momentum for updates is, as a player, I feel like I know where the game is heading, and the dev team has my best interests at heart for the group I'm a part of. So, whether I'm mid-core, whether I'm hardcore, I generally have a sense of I have confidence in the dev team to deliver an update that's going to entertain me. Goodwill is, holy shit, y'all fucked up, I'll stick around. Yeah, it's a good way to, another way to put it is trust.
So would you say so it's kind of like a way to secure any drops, like, just prevent momentum from drops?
I'll say not necessarily prevent momentum from drop, but think about it as if you have a finite amount of time to pull your fanny out of the fire, shall we say. And sometimes that can be 4 months, sometimes that can be 2 weeks, depending on the severity of what actually happened. And there's lots of examples of games dying within 2 weeks because of a fatal-ish actual update and going from there.
Do you see a big difference between mobile and Steam in terms of some of the decisions and how you scored?
I see the differences mainly because mobile gives you less room to actually make any of those mistakes, especially if you are dealing with, say, a giant incumbent or a very popular subgenre. Like PC console generally gives you a little bit more leeway to not just make mistakes, but sort of build back some of that goodwill because those players will understand some of these things make changes. When you're dealing with a more casual audience, the attention is much more fickle in some cases. And, you know, even for games like, say, like Last War and things like that, which are built towards like a more mid-core sort of hardcore audience, all those roads end up in one particular place. And, well, either the player base is willing to deal with it or they aren't. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not.
I'll keep asking questions, but so these situations were kind of like near launch or near post launch. What do you think are the best practices for the long term?
So,
Past that honeymoon stage?
so the honeymoon stage, what you want to do really when we talk about the honeymoon stage is you want to preserve the feeling of importance, because that's the kind of most important thing that a player really needs to feel, is that it's not, hey, you're just looking at me as an amazing wallet that basically just keeps sort of contributing across the board, versus saying, we've delivered this gameplay has to hit a certain level for you guys to basically maintain that level of attention, and here's what we're going to keep giving you on a regular basis. Whenever there's a collective sort of outcry from the player base, it typically means that the content they've received does not match the expectation that was set in the very beginning, and it disappoints them. And, you know, sometimes they leave, sometimes they shout on forums, sometimes they shout on social media, sometimes one YouTuber makes a video, so on and so forth. But if that's goodwill that they're always sort of detecting of, okay, they might have missed this one, they'll come back for the next one. This is why momentum is so important. And being able to say and being able to point back to a series of good decisions from the player base and say, no, they do have our best interests at heart, we can actually stick with this. It is also important to know how when you're operating games for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, you kind of solidify your reputation for the player base. And sometimes if they see the same problem emerge over and over and over again, they will ascribe that to the dev team, and that can create a completely different firestorm.
Was one of the studio classes in the very first decision easier to win this exercise fit?
Nope. Said they're all hard because live is difficult, and even though you may start with goodwill, that goodwill can be eroded by very easy decisions. And in the same way, that goodwill can increase by good decisions. It is 100% dependent on how you operate as a dev team, what that philosophy actually is, and more important, how much it's going to cost you when you do make a mistake and have to actually sit down and correct it. So if an update doesn't hit like you think it does, and it monetizes, say, 50% less, that is an unbelievable hill to climb for the next update because you have to now make more to actually stay in business and so on and so forth. And that really is the tricky part, because at that point you run the risk of over monetizing your players. We got about 15 minutes left for some more questions, so please fire away. There is no such thing as a dumb question in this room. They're all smart.
Do you think it would be to the detriment of AAA to act like an indie launch?
Yes.
And why would you?
It would be like, all right. It would be like if I suddenly turned into Red Hulk. That's not who I am. Like, if you are a AAA studio, the expectation is you're going to deliver a AAA experience. Even if you say, this is a small project, they'll say, why are you building a small project? You're a AAA studio. That's sort of bullshit to the player base. And they just don't buy it, sort of period. So it's important to know where you're sort of going to deliver like those AAA expectations. Like you say, hey guys, we're not focused on fidelity. Okay, that's not what they're going to look for. But if you say we're focused on, say, high-level social play, then they have a different expectation, and that's not there, then they actually sit down and complain. Louder, please.
Yeah, sure. What do you think of like the ROI of like larger narratives like Helldivers 2? They spend a lot of time doing storytelling and kind of developing. Do you feel like that helps with goodwill? Where does that kind of fall?
So story is actually one of the most powerful retention drivers you can have for live games, period. And what I really admire about Helldivers 2, like outside of the fact that, it's just a fantastic game, is the fact that they completely leaned into player consequence and failure. A lot of games don't necessarily try and do that, and it's one of those cases where when you look at black holes that have appeared in swallowed planets or swallowed environments and things like that, when you look at evolving enemies and things like that that have happened over time, that's an entertaining game to actually play because what you do has weight, and more importantly, the developers are acknowledging that story weight with update after update. So if you can put additional story in games, that's fantastic, but you can't put none for a live title and just expect, okay, this is just PvP forever or PvE forever, because the player base will wonder, all right, well, why am I shooting 10,000 guys and sort of coming back to it? So I'd say story is very important. Yeah, Helldivers has done an excellent job of at least thematically sort of continuing that all the way through.
Similar to the mobile question, but more on, you're on Steam, you're free to play or you're paid. Looking at momentum and goodwill, especially goodwill, how does that work? Do you think players give you more leeway if you're free to play? Or
No.
less?
So speaking of personal experience here, they give you vastly less, like because they can bounce at any time, and also because the overall quality of free-to-play titles has risen over time, and happy to have some titles that actually contributed to that. So being good is kind of the baseline. It doesn't matter if you're premium or paid. You better be able to entertain your player base because it's really easy to drop a free-to-play game and go do something else. Even with the premium commitment, it's still a case of, okay, this is not entertaining me. I'm just gonna leave and not buy the next year's edition, or I'm not gonna buy the next expansion, so on and so forth. So the power of free-to-play is that no matter what, you always have to work for the player's money and work for the player's time and work for the player's attention. And if you can't do those things, you are out of business anyway.
We'll bring you the mic so we can hear it.
So in regards to narrative being a powerful tool for player retention, I agree. Like, and like been excited to see more and more narrative in live service games. Do you see any trends in terms of studios bringing narrative teams in earlier in the development process to make sure that the narrative actually is like cohesively built alongside the tech and the design? Or
The short answer is yes. Not enough teams actually do that at scale, because typically the writers or the creative team is sometimes divorced from design,
Yeah.
and sometimes that's a function of necessity in terms of we can't hire the writers, and sometimes that's a force of we don't think the story is important, and the we don't think the story is important, that will always come back to bite you in the ass for a PvE-based title. There's never a moment where the player is going to just buy into things and just keep it going. That's not how they act in terms of inventing narratives for themselves, especially because there are so many other titles that absolutely deliver some level of narrative and basically expect that to continue.
You added a slight detail right there at the end. You said for PvE. So narrative and PvP, thoughts there?
So it directly depends on genre and player expectation. So there are several titles I can name in the past that don't really have much of a story, or the story is the gameplay you are going to commit yourself to via match by match, so on and so forth. And for me personally, I'll just say this. It's always helpful to know what I'm doing and sort of where my character is coming from. It doesn't matter if it's a hero shooter, it doesn't matter if it's anything else. But for PvP, it's actually much more important for the player's progression and the story they are telling themselves of how they are getting better at the game, how they are able to solve those problems in the moment to moment. And that, you know, again, there's a couple titles that prove that sort of right off the bat. That's more of the mental catnip that the player actually needs versus the actual story, because the story they're telling themselves is, I am getting better at this title and I want to keep actually doing it.
If you don't mind a follow-up to that, have you seen any titles do a good job at helping the player learn that story, like telling it back to them? Yeah.
So typically I'd say beyond stats, and this is, I'll say just a general sort of point, the way that the player kind of tells themselves that they're actually getting better is by saying, I have won more matches recently, I have a higher KDR, my team win rate is actually much better, and surfacing that as developers and surfacing that as a team is a really easy way to actually show the player that. And even stuff like, hey, look, 2 months ago you were at a 0.94 KDR. Now you're at 1.3. Okay, clearly you've gotten much better. Now you're not necessarily at the 4 that the insane killers at the other end of the spectrum are, but you're getting there. Ranked mode is actually one of the easiest ways to kind of tell that story as well, because you can say, all right, well, last season I was silver, previous season I was bronze, this time I'm gold. I'm actually getting better. Sometimes that's because we adjust some things on the back end to sort of get players there. Sometimes that's a direct result of the player gaining a lot more skill, and sometimes it's a result of this massive population game that sort of leads to you being able to show your skill against other players that might not have been there before. Time for, I think, 3 more.
Hi, quick question about marketing in general.
Sure.
So you mentioned a lot about community and community engagement. Besides grassroots engagement, is there any recommendation you have in regards to other forms of marketing and how to either maximize retention or regain churned users?
So the key with marketing is you have to keep in mind that any big campaign is a bullhorn that you cannot actually control and target until you actually get a whole bunch of players, understand who's actually going to churn, marketing retargets again, marketing retargets again, marketing retargets again. But that user acquisition funnel, you still have to retain no matter what. And retention is absolutely the responsibility of the game team. It is not marketing's job to actually do that. Marketing's job is to make sure that they're reaching the right players. And sometimes that can take a lot more time than what you actually expect. But the important part is that as long as they're aiming somewhat in the right direction, you're able to sort of entertain those players and actually keep them inside. retention is like just the number one thing, period. So if you have a game that doesn't monetize well but retains, that game always has an actual chance over the game that monetizes really well but retains just okay. The retention will always win in that case.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody.